The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried across the Atlantic by steamship, and then by rail across the breadth of America, before finally reaching the small fishing village in Norway, where Edwin Harlow had spent the last 32 years of his life. He recognized his brother's handwriting immediately, the same cramped, hurried scrawl that Samuel had used since they were boys, learning their letters at their mother's kitchen table in Wyoming. But the words inside were nothing like the cheerful updates Samuel usually sent. These words were desperate. "Edwin, I am sick. The doctor says my lungs are failing and I cannot work the winter. I have 200 sheep and no one to care for them. The hired men have all gone to the mines where the pay is better. If you can come, please come. If you cannot, I will understand, but the flock will die. Your brother, Samuel." Edwin read the letter 3 times, then walked to the window of his small cottage and looked out at the Norwegian fjord where fishing boats bobbed in the gray autumn water. He was 64 years old. He had built a good life here. Simple, quiet, content. His wife had passed 5 years ago, and his children had grown and scattered to cities where opportunities were better than what a fishing village could offer. He had no reason to go back to America. No reason except a brother who needed him, and 200 sheep who would die without care. 3 weeks later, Edwin Harlow stepped off a train in Miles City, Montana, carrying a single leather bag and wearing the heavy wool coat that had served him through 30 Norwegian winters. Samuel was waiting at the station, thinner than Edwin remembered, his face carrying the gray pallor of illness. The brothers embraced without words, holding each other the way men do when they've been apart for decades and don't know how to bridge the distance. "You came," Samuel said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." "You're my brother," Edwin replied, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. The ranch was exactly as Edwin remembered it from his last visit, 15 years ago. A modest house, a weathered barn, and rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The sheep were scattered across the autumn pasture, white dots against the golden grass, oblivious to the drama unfolding among the humans who controlled their fate. 212 last count, Samuel said as they stood on the porch watching the flock. "Good animals, healthy stock. They'll fetch a fair price in spring if they survive the winter." He coughed, a wet rattling sound that made Edwin wince. "I'm sorry to ask this of you. I know you haven't worked sheep in 30 years. "Sheep are sheep," Edwin said. "They haven't changed, and neither have winters." But that wasn't entirely true, and both brothers knew it. Montana winters were different from Norwegian winters, not colder necessarily, but more violent. The wind here had nothing to stop it, no mountains or fjords to break its fury. It came screaming across the plains with a ferocity that could kill a man in minutes and freeze a flock in hours. "The neighbors will help if you need it," Samuel said. "Tom Brennan to the east. He's got 1,000 head of cattle. The Hendersons to the west. They run sheep too. Good people. They'll show you how things work around here." Edwin nodded, but he was already thinking about something else. Watching the open pasture, feeling the wind that never quite stopped blowing, remembering the techniques he'd learned in Norway, where shepherds had been protecting flocks from winter for 1,000 years. "I'll need hay," he said. "A lot of it. More than you usually keep." Samuel looked puzzled. "There's hay in the barn, enough for normal feeding. I'll need more, enough to build with." "Build what?" Edwin smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost mischievous. Something I learned from the Sami people up in Lapland. They've been keeping reindeer alive through Arctic winters since before anyone was writing history. They taught me a few things. Samuel shook his head slowly, but there was trust in his eyes. You always did have strange ideas, brother, even when we were boys. Strange ideas kept me alive for 64 years. They'll keep your sheep alive too. The first time Tom Brennan rode over to introduce himself, Edwin was already hauling hay bales out to the middle of the north pasture. Brennan was a big man, red-faced and prosperous, with the easy confidence of someone who had been ranching in Montana long enough to consider himself an expert on everything related to livestock. "You must be Samuel's brother," Brennan called out, reining his horse beside the growing pile of hay. "The one from Norway. I'm Tom Brennan, your neighbor to the east." Edwin set down the bale he was carrying and wiped his forehead with a kerchief. "Edwin Harlow, pleased to meet you." "What in God's name are you doing with all that hay? You planning to feed those sheep in the middle of a field?" "Not feed them, shelter them." Brennan's eyebrows rose toward his hat brim. "Shelter? With hay?" Edwin began explaining his plan. A circular wall of hay bales, stacked 3 high, creating a windbreak that would protect the flock from the killing gusts that accompanied Montana blizzards. The sheep would huddle inside, their combined body heat warming the enclosed space while the walls blocked the wind that stripped heat from living things faster than any cold temperature alone. "The Sami do something similar with snow walls for their reindeer," Edwin explained. "But hay works better because you can build it before the storm hits, and the sheep can eat it if food runs short." Brennan listened with the polite expression of a man humoring a lunatic. "That's interesting, but we don't do things that way here. When a storm comes, you drive the flock to the barn. Simple. Your barn holds 200 sheep? Well, no, maybe 50. But you rotate them, keep the weakest ones inside, and the rest freeze while they wait their turn." Brennan's face reddened slightly. "Look, I've been ranching here for 20 years. Lost some animals, sure. But that's just how it is. You can't save them all. In Norway, we believe you should try." The conversation ended shortly after, Brennan riding away with the bemused expression of someone who had just encountered a fascinating new species of fool. Edwin returned to stacking hay, untroubled by the judgment. He had encountered skepticism before. He would encounter it again. The only opinion that mattered was the one the winter would deliver. Word spread quickly through the ranching community that Samuel Harlow's strange brother was building something peculiar in the north pasture. Visitors came by over the following days, drawn by curiosity and the universal human desire to witness foolishness firsthand. Martha Henderson, who ran the sheep operation west of Samuel's land with her husband George, was kinder than most. "It's certainly creative," she said, watching Edwin shape the circular wall with precise, practiced movements. "I've never seen anything like it." "That's because no one here has tried it," Edwin replied. He lifted another bale into position, grunting slightly with the effort. 64 years had not been entirely kind to his back. Back in Norway, shepherds have been building winter shelters for centuries. Different materials, same principle. Block the wind, trap the heat, keep the animals together. And it works? "I've never lost a sheep to winter cold, not once in 30 years. Martha considered this. "But Norwegian winters are different from Montana winters. Cold is cold. Wind is wind, sheep are sheep. Edwin smiled at her, his blue eyes crinkling with warmth. The mountains here are different. The grass is different. The people speak different words. But winter? He shook his head. Winter is the same everywhere. It wants to kill anything that isn't prepared. The only question is whether you're prepared. Martha left thoughtful rather than mocking, which Edwin considered progress. Others were less open-minded. A group of ranch hands from the Brennan spread rode by one afternoon, hooting and hollering as they passed. "Hey, old man, you building a fort to fight Indians? Little late for that?" "Maybe it's a sheep church. Gonna baptize 'em before the snow comes." Edwin waved pleasantly at the young men as they rode past, their laughter carrying across the empty prairie. He had been young once himself, certain that he knew everything worth knowing. Winter had taught him otherwise. It would teach them too, eventually. By early November, the circular wall was complete, 60 feet in diameter, with walls 4 feet high and 3 bales thick. Edwin had left a single gap on the south side, narrow enough to block most wind, but wide enough for sheep to enter and exit. The interior space could hold all 200 sheep, with room for them to move, lie down, and gather around the central fire pit he dug and lined with stones. Samuel watched from the porch as Edwin made final adjustments to the structure, his brother's illness keeping him confined to the house more often than not. "It's really something," Samuel said when Edwin came in for supper. "Looks like a castle wall out there." That's what the young men said. A sheep castle. Edwin chuckled. "I've been called worse." "Does it bother you? The jokes? The skepticism?" Edwin considered the question while spooning stew into his bowl. "When I first moved to Norway, the fishermen thought I was crazy too. An American who wanted to learn their ways instead of teaching them the American way. They laughed at my accent, my mistakes, my ideas. But after a few years, they stopped laughing. Not because I proved them wrong, but because I proved I was willing to learn. And now? You think these ranchers will learn from you? Maybe, maybe not." Edwin shrugged. "I'm not here to teach anyone. I'm here to keep your sheep alive. What others do with their own flocks is their business." Samuel was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table to grip his brother's hand. "I'm glad you came, Edwin. Whatever happens, I'm glad you came. So am I, brother, so am I." The first snow fell on November 18th, a light dusting that melted by noon. The second snow came a week later, heavier but still manageable. Edwin began moving the sheep into the circular enclosure each evening, letting them out to graze during the day when conditions permitted. The animals adapted quickly to the routine, following Edwin's whistles and calls with the easy trust that sheep develop for shepherds who treat them with patience and kindness. He talked to them constantly as he worked, not words they could understand, but sounds that soothed and reassured, that told them they were safe and cared for. "You're a funny one, aren't you, girl?" he said to a ewe who insisted on pressing against his leg whenever he stood still, always wanting attention, just like my wife's cat back in Norway. Never could leave me alone. The ewe bleated in response, and Edwin scratched behind her ears, smiling at the simple pleasure of connection with another living creature. December brought colder temperatures and longer nights. Edwin developed a rhythm, up before dawn to check the flock, a simple breakfast with Samuel, then hours of maintenance and preparation. He reinforced the hay walls where wind or curious sheep had weakened them. He stockpiled firewood near the enclosure. He created paths through the snow that was beginning to accumulate, ensuring he could reach the flock quickly if conditions worsened. "You work harder than men half your age," Martha Henderson observed during one of her visits. She had taken to stopping by regularly, bringing bread or preserves from her kitchen and staying to watch Edwin work. "Don't you ever rest?" "Rest is for when the work is done," Edwin replied. "And the work is never done, not really. There's always something that needs tending, something that needs fixing, something that needs watching." "That sounds exhausting." "It sounds like living." Edwin straightened from the fence post he'd been adjusting, pressing a hand to his lower back. "When I stop working, I start thinking too much. About the past, about the future, about all the things I can't change. Better to stay busy, better to focus on what's in front of me." Martha looked out at the sheep, placid and content within their hay fortress. "They seem happy, calmer than my own flock. Sheep know when they're safe. They can feel it." Edwin walked toward the enclosure, and Martha followed. "When they're anxious, they scatter. When they're content, they stay put. They stay close. Look at them now, clustered but not crowded, resting but alert. That's what safety looks like. And you created that. The safety, I mean." Edwin shook his head. "I just built walls and showed up every day. The sheep created their own peace. I only gave them the conditions to find it." The Great Blizzard arrived on January 9th, 1887, without warning and without mercy. One moment, the sky was clear and cold, the kind of winter day that made Montana almost beautiful. The next moment, the horizon disappeared behind a wall of white that advanced across the prairie with terrifying speed. Edwin was in the pasture when he saw it coming. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the storm hit. 10 minutes to get 200 sheep into the enclosure and seal the entrance behind them. He ran, his old legs pumping harder than they had in years, his voice calling the commands he'd practiced 100 times. The sheep, trained by weeks of routine, responded immediately, flowing toward the enclosure in a river of wool. Edwin counted them as they passed. 198, 199, 200, 201, 202. And then he was through the gap himself, hauling hay bales into position to narrow the entrance to a sliver. The storm hit like a physical blow, wind screaming across the plains with a fury that drowned out thought. Temperature plummeted 40 degrees in less than an hour. Snow fell so thick that Edwin couldn't see the wall on the opposite side of the enclosure, couldn't see anything but white chaos and the dim shapes of sheep pressing against his legs. He found the fire pit by memory, his frozen fingers fumbling with matches that the wind tried to tear from his grip. The first match failed. The second. The third caught, flame touching kindling, then larger wood, then the careful construction of a fire that would burn for hours if he fed it properly. The sheep gathered around the warmth, their bodies forming concentric circles with the fire at the center. Steam rose from their wool as body heat met cold air. Their combined mass generated warmth that the hay walls trapped inside the enclosure, creating a microclimate that defied the killing, cold raging just feet away. Edwin positioned himself among his flock, sharing their warmth as they shared his fire. He talked to them through the howling wind, nonsense words and half-remembered songs from his childhood, anything to keep himself awake and alert. The storm lasted 3 days. Inside the enclosure, time lost meaning. Edwin measured hours by the amount of wood he burned, by the number of times he checked the walls for damage, by the slow rhythm of sheep breathing around him. He ate sparingly from the supplies he'd stockpiled. Dried meat, hard bread, a flask of whiskey that he rationed carefully. He melted snow for water, sharing it with sheep whose muzzles were frosted with ice. He moved through the flock constantly, checking for signs of distress, separating any animal that seemed weak and positioning it closer to the fire. On the second night, a ewe went into labor. Edwin delivered the lamb by firelight, his frozen hands somehow steady for the delicate work. The mother cleaned her baby while sheep gathered around to watch, their presence providing warmth that might have been the difference between life and death for the newborn. "Welcome to the world, little one," Edwin murmured, wrapping the lamb in his own coat until its wool dried. "Not the easiest beginning, but you'll have a story to tell." The lamb survived. They all survived. When the storm finally broke on January 12th, Edwin emerged from the enclosure into a world transformed. Snow had drifted 20 feet high against the hay walls, but the walls had held. Inside, 213 sheep, counting the new arrival, stood healthy and alert, watching their shepherd with the trust that he had earned through 3 days of desperate care. Edwin sat down in the snow and cried, not from sadness, not from relief, but from the sheer overwhelming gratitude of having made it through. The scale of the disaster became clear over the following days as survivors ventured out to assess the damage. Tom Brennan lost 400 cattle, nearly half his herd. The animals had been caught in the open when the storm hit, unable to reach shelter, frozen where they stood. His ranch hands found them scattered across the prairie like statues, preserved by the cold that had killed them. The Henderson Ranch fared little better. They lost 60 sheep despite driving them toward the barn, the animals piling up against doors that opened outward and couldn't be cleared of drifting snow. George Henderson dug for 6 hours to reach the barn, only to find most of his flock already dead. Across Montana, the story repeated with devastating consistency. Cattle ranchers lost up to 90% of their herds. Sheep operations were wiped out entirely. The winter of 1887 would eventually be called the Great Die-Up, the worst livestock disaster in American history. And on Samuel Harlow's ranch, not a single sheep was lost. Tom Brennan was the first neighbor to visit after the storm, riding up on a horse that looked as exhausted as its rider. He sat in his saddle staring at the hay enclosure, at the sheep grazing peacefully within its walls, at Edwin scattering feed across the trampled snow. "How?" Brennan asked. Just the one word, but it carried the weight of 400 dead animals and a lifetime of assumptions proven wrong. Edwin walked over to stand beside the rancher's horse. The same way the Sami have survived Arctic winters for 1,000 years. Walls to break the wind, bodies to share heat, fire to warm the center. Nothing complicated, nothing new. Just old knowledge that people here forgot to ask about. "I called you a fool." "I remember. Those boys from my ranch, the ones who mocked you, I remember them too." Brennan's face crumpled, pride finally breaking under the weight of grief and regret. "I'm sorry. God help me. I'm sorry. I should have listened. I should have asked questions instead of making jokes." Edwin reached up and gripped the man's arm. the gesture of one neighbor to another. You'll know for next time. That's what matters. There might not be a next time. I don't know if I can rebuild from this. You can. You will. Edwin's voice was firm, certain. Because that's what ranchers do. What people do. We get knocked down and we get back up, and we learn from what knocked us down, so it can't knock us down the same way again. Brennan left with tears freezing on his cheeks, but he also left with the beginnings of a plan. If he did rebuild, he would do it differently. He would ask questions. He would learn. Spring came slowly to Montana that year, the snow retreating inch by inch as if reluctant to release its grip on the land. Samuel's health improved with the warming weather, enough that he could walk out to the pasture and see for himself what his brother had built. 213, Samuel said, counting the sheep that grazed across the green grass. You brought them all through, every single one. 214, actually, Edwin corrected. The lamb is growing fast. The brothers stood in comfortable silence, watching the flock that had become a local legend. Ranchers came from 100 miles away to see the hay fortress that had defied the worst winter in memory. Most left with sketches and notes, determined to build their own versions before the next cold season arrived. You could stay, Samuel said quietly. Montana could use men like you, men who know things that we've forgotten. Edwin considered the offer. Part of him was tempted. There was work here, purpose here, the satisfaction of being needed. But another part of him remembered a small cottage overlooking a Norwegian fjord, the grave of a wife who waited for him to come home. I'll stay through summer, he said finally. Help you get back on your feet properly. But come fall, I need to go back. Norway is home now. Has been for 30 years. Samuel nodded, understanding without needing explanation. Then we'll make the most of the summer. And maybe you'll write more often than you used to? Maybe I will. They walked back to the house together, two brothers who had been separated by an ocean and brought back together by a crisis, by 200 sheep, and by the simple truth that family means showing up when you're needed. Edwin Harlow returned to Norway in September 1887, leaving behind a brother restored to health, a flock that would thrive for years, and a community transformed by disaster and knowledge. The hay fortress technique spread across Montana and beyond, adapted and refined by ranchers who had learned the hard way that old wisdom often outperforms new arrogance. By the winter of 1888, dozens of circular shelters dotted the prairie, protecting thousands of animals from storms that would have killed them just 2 years earlier. Tom Brennan rebuilt his ranch, smaller but smarter, with windbreaks and shelters that his cattle could reach quickly when storms approached. He named his new breeding bull Edwin as a joke that became a tribute, the animal's descendants carrying the name for generations. Samuel lived another 12 years, dying peacefully in the spring of 1899 with a letter from Edwin in his hand, the latest in a correspondence that had continued unbroken since Edwin's departure. The brothers never saw each other again in person, but they were closer in those final years than they had been since childhood. And in a small village in Norway, an old man sat by his fire on winter evenings, watching the snow fall outside his window, and remembering a season when he'd built a fortress out of hay to save 200 sheep. His neighbors there thought the story was exaggerated, the details embellished by time and distance. But Edwin knew the truth. Some walls are built from stone, some from wood, some from desperate hope and borrowed knowledge. The best walls, though, are built from love. Love for a brother, love for a flock, love for the simple, stubborn act of keeping things alive when the world tries to kill them. The winter of 1887 had been the deadliest in Montana's history. But inside a circle of hay bales, warmed by a small fire and the bodies of 200 trusting sheep, one old man had proven that survival is not about strength or luck or even preparation. It's about knowing that the wisdom of the past still works in the present, if only we're humble enough to use it.